Hello there, Year 10. Last lesson we looked at the importance of the Suez Canal and the reasons for Britain's involvement in Egypt. Today we're going back down to the opposite end of the African continent to try and understand a war you may have heard of. It's in some ways largely been forgotten in Britain today, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. So the title for today is simply, what was the Boer War? So to understand this war and its significance for the British Empire, we first need to understand the history of South Africa. As you know, up until 1869, the year the Suez Canal opened, all ships that were travelling between Europe and Asia had to go around the southern tip of the African continent. So this map here shows the southern tip of Africa. If we look back at this map, we've looked at this before. Here's the African continent, the Atlantic Ocean on this side, here's Europe up here, so any ships going to Asia would have to go through the Atlantic, round the southern tip of Africa called the Cape of Good Hope, up through the Indian Ocean, and then arrive over here somewhere in Asia. So the first Europeans to make that trip were the Portuguese, starting with Vasco da Gama in 1497. They were then followed by the English, as you know, travelling to India, the East India Company, but also slightly before the English did that, the Dutch. So people from the Netherlands were doing the same, travelling between Europe and Asia. They set up a company, the Dutch East India Company, actually set up just before the English East India Company. They were the first ones to think of this idea of a company going off to look for economic resources to bring back in trade. And the Dutch East India Company were very successful. They had the monopoly in the 17th century over the so-called Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, and the Dutch ruled over the country that's now known as Indonesia for several centuries. So what's all this got to do with South Africa? If we think about in the 17th century, ships from Europe, from Holland, from the Netherlands, travelling around the southern tip of Africa, going up to Asia. And if you've got a lot of ships going from one place to another, you need somewhere to stop off. And in the 1650s, the Dutch set up this colony here, called in Dutch Kaapstad, in English Cape Town. Originally set up as a place to mend ships that had been damaged on the first part of the voyage, somewhere where people could stop off, get a bite to eat, and it was a long voyage, as you know. Obviously, there were indigenous people already living in South Africa, the Khoisan people, but the Dutch set up their own colony, much like the English and Dutch and other people did in North America as well. So this colony is set up here by the Dutch in the 1650s. And things continued like that for a while. In 1795, Britain took over Cape Colony. So the colony had expanded by this point, encompassed a large part of southern Africa, not quite as much as is on this map. I'll explain why in a sec. But in 1795, Britain took over Cape Colony from the Dutch. There was a war between Britain and the Netherlands, and Britain won, took over Cape Colony. Now, the people who were living in Cape Colony by this time, most of them had Dutch ancestry, although there were also Germans and French included as well. But they'd kind of stopped thinking of themselves first and foremost as being Dutch. They had their own kind of identity. They called themselves Afrikaners, which literally in Dutch, or their own language, their own version of Dutch called Afrikaans, it just means they call themselves Africans. So a bit like the colonists the English colonists in North America had started to refer to themselves as Americans. These Dutch settlers and their descendants called themselves Africans or Afrikaners. The other word for them is Boers, which is obviously where we get the word the Boer War from. Boer is a Dutch word meaning farmer, because most of the settlers and their descendants, the Dutch who were living in Cape Colony, made their living from farming, producing things like wine and other economic resources that came from farming. They also relied quite heavily on slave labour from the local Khoisan people and other Southern African people who had been forced into slavery on those farms. So, 1795, the British take over, and some of the Afrikaners, or the Boers, the Dutch-speaking or Afrikaans-speaking inhabitants of South Africa, weren't very happy about that. They weren't happy about being forced to speak English. They wanted to speak their own language. And in 1834, they got even more unhappy because the British Empire in that year banned slavery in all British colonies. And that meant that the Dutch farmers, or the Boer farmers, felt that they weren't going to be able to continue making a living. Without slave labour, they couldn't see a way forward. So quite a lot of the Boer settlers decided they would leave British control and go and set up their own colony somewhere else. So these people were called the Voortrekkers, and it was called the Great Trek. This is a word that has passed into the English language, a trek meaning a long and difficult walk, but actually that word originates in the Afrikaans language because most of these people did walk. They walked from Cape Colony to the north and to the east, and they set up two new areas called Transvaal and the Orange Free State. So that colour orange, referring back to their Dutch ancestry, the colour orange is heavily associated with the Netherlands. If you've ever seen the Dutch football team play, you'll know they play in an orange kit. And so these Voortrekkers, these Boer settlers, moved out. They left British control. Some stayed behind, but lots of them left and set up their own colonies, Johannesburg being the main town up there in Transvaal. And again, things kind of settled down then and continued as normal. But then, in the 1860s, diamonds were discovered in Orange Free State and in Transvaal. And so the British Empire, was pretty interested in taking over the Orange Free State, taking over Transvaal, and being able to exploit those economic resources, diamonds. They knew they'd be worth loads of money. So a war broke out between the Boers trying to defend their new homelands and the British. The Boers won, and the British had to kind of put on hold their plans to take over those Boer settlements. But that wasn't the Boer War, that was kind of the prelude, the first Boer War it's sometimes called. The big Boer War, the second Boer War, came in the 1890s when gold was discovered in the Orange Free State and in Transvaal. And gold was worth even more than diamonds. So Cecil Rhodes, you might remember him, he was by this point the Prime Minister of Cape Colony, and when he found out that gold had been discovered in Orange Free State and Transvaal, he pushed for another war against the Boer people. He thought, now Britain's grown even further in strength, we've got Maxim guns, let's take over those Boer settlements. And what followed was a 3-year conflict, a very bloody conflict, a terrible conflict that claimed a lot of British lives, a lot of Boer lives, saw some atrocities being committed. Notably, this was the first time that the phrase concentration camp was used. The concentration camp was a British invention during the Boer War. We are much more likely to hear about it in this country when we're referring to Nazi Germany, and you'll be learning about the concentration camps that existed in Germany and in Eastern Europe, set up by the Nazis in year 11. But the first usage of the term, the concentration camp, was basically invented by the British in the Boer War. Now that doesn't mean extermination camps. somewhere like Auschwitz. Auschwitz wasn't a concentration camp, it was a death camp, an extermination camp. The British didn't set up places like that with gas chambers, people being killed on that industrial scale. Concentration camp means a lot of people being concentrated in one location. And the British used those during the Boer War to concentrate Boer families, men, women, children, in one place altogether. Now, often those places were rife with disease. Sometimes the British government knew that disease was going to kill off a lot of people, so you could argue that they, in some ways, the deaths of a lot of people in those concentration camps were actually deliberate. It's just an important point, I think. Everybody should know that concentration camps were originally a British invention. So, the work that I want you to complete today. First of all, you're going to make your own version of this map of Southern Africa, so you've got that kind of the geography of the Boer War sorted. Then I would like you to complete a mind map, which I've put on a worksheet for you, looking at the causes, consequences, conditions of the Boer War. And all of that is explained for you on the sheet. You've got the textbook pages to help you as well. Good luck with the work.